Learn English through story. The shadowed affair. The evening air carried a hush over the city as Eleanor sat at her writing desk, the soft glow of a single candle illuminating the paper before her. The ink shimmered slightly as she dipped her quill, poised to capture the thoughts swirling in her mind. Outside, the world continued, but within her study, time felt suspended in quiet anticipation. She had once believed in the permanence of love, in the steadfast nature of devotion. Yet, as the years unfolded, she had come to understand the delicate threads that held people together, the secrets nestled within silences, the betrayals that were not acts of malice, but rather the quiet choices, made in the name of self-preservation. Across the city, in a townhouse adorned with memories, Henry Whitmore stood by the window, staring out into the dim-lit street below. He had received Eleanor's letter earlier that afternoon, a single sheet folded carefully, carrying words that both soothed and unsettled him. It was not an accusation, nor was it a plea. It was simply an acknowledgement of recognition of what had been, of what could never be. Henry had not meant for things to unfold as they had. When he first met Eleanor, she had been a woman of quiet grace, her intelligence sharp yet softened by kindness. They had spoken of books and philosophy, of the intricacies of the human heart. He had not imagined then that their conversations would weave something so delicate between them, something that would become difficult to name, impossible to define. He had admired her from afar, respecting the boundaries she had drawn, the life she had built. She was married to a man who was neither cruel nor unkind, merely absent in the ways that mattered. Henry had not thought himself a man prone to indiscretion, yet his heart had betrayed him before his mind could protest. Their affair had not been one of passion in the conventional sense. There had been no stolen embraces in dim corridors, no whispered confessions in secret corners. Instead, their intimacy had been crafted through letters, through glances exchanged in crowded rooms, through the knowledge that something unspoken existed between them. Eleanor had known the dangers of indulging in such sentiments. She had been raised to value duty, to honor the commitments made before God and society. And yet, as the years passed, she found herself drawn to Henry, not in defiance of those values but because he understood the loneliness she had never dared to voice. Theirs had been a love shaped by restraint, by the ache of what could not be. They had navigated their emotions with the precision of those who knew the consequences of carelessness. And yet, even the most careful of steps could not prevent the inevitable. It had been a simple moment an afternoon in the park, where the golden light of autumn had painted the world in warmth. They had spoken as they always did, their words weaving between the lines of propriety. But that day something shifted. Eleanor had laughed, truly laughed, in a way she had not in years. Henry had reached for her hand without thinking, and she had not pulled away. It was not a grand betrayal. It was a fleeting moment, a single breath of honesty in a life carefully constructed on duty. Yet it had been enough. Enough for Eleanor to know that she stood on the precipice of something irreversible. Enough for Henry to recognize that their careful balance had begun to waver. And so, she had written to him, not to end what had never truly begun, but to acknowledge it, to place words upon the silence, to give shape to what had lingered in the spaces between them. Now, as Henry stood by the window, he held the letter once more, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her handwriting. He did not know if he would reply. Perhaps there was nothing left to say, or perhaps some things were meant to remain unfinished. their beauty preserved in what was left unsaid. Eleanor, seated at her desk, let out a slow breath. The candlelight flickered as she folded the second letter, placing it beside the first. This one would not be sent. It was not for Henry. It was for herself, for the woman she had been, for the woman she was becoming. The shadowed affair had never been about stolen moments or clandestine meetings. It had been about understanding, about seeing and being seen. And sometimes, she thought, that was the greatest intimacy of all. The city continued beyond her window, its lights shimmering in the quiet of the night. And Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, felt at peace. The days that followed carried an odd weight, neither sorrowful nor light, but filled with an understanding that something had shifted. Something delicate had been acknowledged and set aside. Eleanor moved through her routine with the same precision as always. Yet there was a subtle difference, a quiet knowing within her. She had written her truth, and whether Henry responded or not, it no longer held her captive. She spent more time in the garden, tending to the roses that had begun to bloom with the early signs of spring. The air was rich with the scent of earth and renewal, and as she knelt in the soil, she felt the steady rhythm of her own existence grounding her. There was a certain peace in tending to something that expected nothing in return, something that simply grew, untouched by the weight of expectation. Her husband, Charles, took notice of her quietude, though he did not ask. He was not a man prone to deep inquiries, nor one who delved into emotions that ran beneath the surface. He was steady, predictable, qualities Eleanor had once found reassuring. Now, she wondered if their marriage had become more of a structure than a partnership, a series of roles played rather than a life truly shared. One evening, as they sat across from one another at the dinner table, Charles glanced up from his plate and studied her. "You seem different lately," he observed. Eleanor lifted her gaze, surprised by his remark. "Different how?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Quieter, perhaps, or more settled. I can't quite tell." She smiled, though it was not meant to reassure him, merely an acknowledgement of the truth. "I think I've been reflecting." Charles nodded slowly, as if considering whether to ask more. That in the end, he simply returned to his meal. Eleanor did not blame him for his silence. They had long learned to exist within the spaces between words. Henry, meanwhile, found himself carrying Eleanor's letter with him, as if it were an anchor. He had read it countless times, memorizing the careful phrasing, the delicate restraint woven into every sentence. He had thought of responding, of giving shape to his own thoughts. Yet each time he put pen to paper, the words felt insufficient. Instead, he allowed time to settle around him, to weave clarity into the feelings he had spent years suppressing. He had loved Eleanor, perhaps more than he should have, but he also understood that love, in its truest form, was not meant to be possessive. It was not about taking, but about understanding, about seeing someone wholly and letting them be. One afternoon, as he walked through the market, he saw a book vendor setting up a display of old novels. The sight reminded him of Eleanor, of the countless discussions they had shared about literature, about the power of words to shape the soul. Without much thought, he picked up a volume and turned the pages, his fingers grazing the worn edges. He hesitated, then purchased it, not for himself but for her, not as a declaration, but as a quiet offering, a final piece of their unspoken story. That evening, he sent it to her without a note, without an explanation. Just the book, wrapped in simple brown paper, left at her doorstep. When Eleanor found it, she did not need a letter to know who had sent it. She ran her fingers over the cover, a small smile touching her lips. It was a book they had once discussed, one she had mentioned wanting to read. He had remembered, and that, she thought, was enough. Life continued, as it always did. The shadows of their affair did not fade completely, but they softened, becoming part of the fabric of their histories, woven into who they were. Eleanor did not regret what had never come to be. Some loves were meant to remain just as they were, unspoken, unresolved but never forgotten. And in that quiet knowing, there was peace. The days stretched into weeks, and as the seasons shifted, so too did the quiet spaces in Eleanor's heart. She had not expected Henry's gift, nor had she needed a response to the letter she had written. Yet, when she unwrapped the book and ran her fingers over the familiar cover, something deep within her settled. It was not a grand gesture, not an attempt to resurrect what had never fully formed, but rather an acknowledgement of final thread in the tapestry of what had been. She placed the book on her writing desk and hesitated before opening it. The pages smelled of time, of stories waiting to be read, of thoughts yet to be pondered. As she turned to the first chapter, she could not help but wonder if Henry had read it before sending it, if his fingers had traced the same lines she now read. For days she carried the book with her, slipping it into the small basket she took to the garden, setting it beside her tea in the afternoons. She read slowly, savouring the words, allowing them to sink in. It felt almost as though Henry were there with her, as though the book was a quiet conversation between them, spoken in the language of literature they had always shared. She did not write to him. There was no need. Some things were best left in their final form, untouched by the temptation to prolong what had already reached its natural conclusion. Instead, she let herself appreciate the gift for what it was, an offering of understanding, a final kindness between two souls who had met in the shadows of longing but had chosen not to stray into the depths of ruin. Charles remained unaware of the subtle shifts in her, or if he noticed, he chose not to speak of them. Their marriage continued as it always had, steady and unchanging, a structure built on routine rather than passion. Eleanor had long stopped expecting anything else from him, and in many ways she no longer resented it. Their relationship was not one of cruelty, nor was it devoid of companionship. It was simply a life lived side by side, without the fire of deep intimacy. One afternoon, as she sat by the window with the book open in her lap, Charles entered the room. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You seem lost in thought," he said. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Just reading." He stepped closer, glancing at the title. "That book, it's not one I recall seeing before." She hesitated only briefly before answering. "It was a gift." "From whom?" Eleanor closed the book gently, considering her response. There was no reason to lie. Yet the truth was not something Charles would fully understand. "A friend," she said simply. Charles studied her, and for a moment she wondered if he would ask more. But then he nodded, as though the answer was sufficient, and turned his attention elsewhere. It struck her then how little they truly knew of each other's inner worlds. She had been married to this man for years, and yet the things that stirred her soul, the books she read, the thoughts that kept her awake at night, remained unknown to him. That evening, as they dined together, she found herself watching him with new eyes. Had Charles ever longed for something beyond their marriage? Had he ever met someone who made him feel seen in the way Henry had made her feel? If he had, would he have spoken of it? Or would he, too, have carried it in silence? The thought lingered as she finished her meal, and for the first time in years, she felt a quiet curiosity about the man across from her. They had spent so long existing within the roles assigned to them, husband and wife, provider and homemaker, that she had never considered what lay beneath. Later that night, as she sat in bed with the book open on her lap, Charles spoke again. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we had chosen differently?" She turned to him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean? If we had married other people? If we had pursued different lives?" Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the question settling between them. "I think everyone wonders at some point." He nodded, as if he had expected the answer. "I suppose so." A silence stretched between them, but it was not an uncomfortable one. For the first time in years, she felt as though they were standing at the edge of something new, not passion, not rekindled love, but understanding. Perhaps that was enough. As the months passed, Eleanor continued reading the book, and when she finished, she placed it carefully on the shelf. She never wrote to Henry, and he never wrote to her. Their story had found its ending, not in tragedy or longing, but in quiet acceptance. And as she stepped into the garden one morning, breathing in the scent of blooming roses, she realized she was not sad. She had loved in her own way. She had been seen. And in the end, she had chosen peace. The months passed with a quiet certainty, the edges of Eleanor's heart no longer frayed by longing, but softened by understanding. She had once believed that love was something defined by presence, by touch, by words spoken aloud, by a life entwined. Now, she understood that love, in its purest form, could exist in silence, in the spaces between moments, in the choices left unmade. She moved through her days with a newfound ease, tending to her garden, attending social gatherings when required, and finding solace in the books that filled her shelves. Henry's gift remained among them, untouched since she had finished reading it, yet ever present, a quiet reminder of something beautiful and unfinished, yet complete in its own way. One afternoon, while arranging a bouquet of fresh roses in the drawing room, a letter arrived. The sight of it gave her pause, though she quickly dismissed any foolish hope that it was from Henry. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and deliberate, and as she opened it, her heart remained steady. It was an invitation. Lady Margaret Hollingsworth, a long-time acquaintance and frequent host of literary salons, was inviting Eleanor to an evening of discussion among friends. Such gatherings were not uncommon, though Eleanor had never paid them much mind before. She had always been content to live within the quiet world of her own thoughts, preferring private reflection to public discourse. Yet something in her shifted as she read the invitation. Perhaps it was the knowledge that life would continue to unfold, regardless of what she had once longed for. Perhaps it was the simple realization that she did not wish to remain spectator in her own existence. When the evening arrived, Eleanor dressed with care, not for anyone in particular, but for herself. She chose a gown of deep blue, elegant but understated, and pinned her hair in a way that framed her face softly. As she stepped into the carriage, she felt something she had not felt in a long while, a quiet anticipation, a sense of stepping into the unknown. Lady Margaret's home was filled with warm candlelight and the hum of conversation. The room was filled with familiar faces, though Eleanor had never considered many of them close. She moved through the space with measured ease, exchanging pleasantries before settling into a seat near the fireplace. The discussion for the evening centered around literature, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor found herself fully engaged. She spoke not out of duty, but because she wanted to, because the words came easily, because the thoughts in her mind had found a space to breathe. As the evening progressed, she became aware of someone listening to her with quiet attentiveness. He was seated across the room, his gaze thoughtful, his expression one of genuine interest. She did not know his name, but there was something familiar in his demeanor and ease, a quiet intelligence. When the conversation lulled, he finally spoke. "You have a way of seeing things differently, Mrs. Langford. It's rare." She turned to him, surprised. "And how is it that you see things?" A slow smile touched his lips. "With curiosity, with the understanding that most things are not as simple as they seem." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then allowed herself a small smile in return. The evening continued, and though they did not exchange many words, a quiet understanding settled between them. As Eleanor stepped out into the night, the air cool against her skin, she realized something. Life would go on. There would be conversations yet to be had, books yet to be read, moments yet to be lived. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was still room for something new. The carriage ride home was quiet, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the cobbled streets. Eleanor leaned slightly against the window, her thoughts lingering on the evening's conversations. There had been something invigorating about it, not just the intellectual exchange, but the feeling of being present, of engaging with the world rather than simply existing within it. And then, of course, there was him. She had not expected to notice anyone in particular, nor had she sought attention. But there had been something about the way he had listened, the way his gaze had rested on her without expectation or demand. It was not admiration in the way she had once experienced with Henry, nor was it the indifferent regard of her husband. It was something else entirely. Curiosity. As the carriage slowed before her home, Eleanor took a deep breath. She was not a woman prone to frivolous notions she knew better than to assign meaning to a single encounter. But as she stepped onto the familiar stone path leading to her door, she felt the quiet stirrings of something she could not yet name. The house was dark except for the dim glow of a lamp left burning in the hallway. Charles had already retired for the night, his absence neither surprising nor unsettling. She moved through the house with quiet ease, pausing only when she reached the bookshelf where Henry's gift still rested. Her fingers hesitated before tracing the spine. She had thought once that this book would be the final mark of an affair never fully realized, that it would be the last story left unfinished in her life. But now, standing here in the hush of her home, she realized something. She was not finished. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a clarity she had not felt in years. She did not rush through her routine, nor did she linger in idle reflection. Instead, she moved with quiet purpose, allowing herself the simple pleasure of being present in her own life. A week passed before she saw him again. Lady Margaret hosted another gathering, this time an afternoon tea in the garden, where conversation flowed as freely as the sunlight through the trees. Eleanor had considered declining the invitation, but something in her resisted retreating into solitude. And so she went. He was there, as she suspected he might be. She still did not know his name, though she found she was not troubled by the mystery. He was seated beneath the shade of a willow, engaged in conversation with a gentleman Eleanor vaguely recognized from previous events. Their eyes met across the garden, and he inclined his head in a silent greeting. It was not an invitation, nor was it a dismissal. It was merely an acknowledgement. And somehow that was enough. As the afternoon unfolded, Eleanor found herself drawn into discussions that challenged her thoughts, into moments that reminded her that she was still capable of more than quiet longing. She had spent so long believing that true love, was something unattainable, that it existed only in the spaces between what was and what could never be. But now, as she sat among friends, laughter threading through the warm air, she realized something. Love was not always a grand, impossible thing. Sometimes it was simply choosing to be present, to listen, to be seen. And as Eleanor lifted her teacup to her lips, she allowed herself the quiet luxury of hope, not for love as she had once imagined it, but for whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with an unfamiliar lightness, a quiet shifting of something deep within Eleanor's soul. It was not the dizzying rush of passion she had once felt in Henry's presence, nor was it the stagnant certainty of her marriage. It was something new, something in between, a quiet awakening to the possibility that life still held surprises. She did not rush to seek them out. Instead, she allowed them to come to her. A week after the garden gathering, another invitation arrived, this time from Lady Margaret herself, written in her bold, elegant script. A more intimate affair, she promised, a small dinner for only a select few. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before penning her acceptance. The evening arrived, and with it, a sense of quiet anticipation Eleanor could not name. The Hollingsworth estate was a grand home, filled with warmth and laughter, but tonight it seemed softer, more intimate. Candles flickered against polished wood, the scent of fresh flowers lingering in the air. Eleanor entered the drawing room and was greeted with smiles, warm conversation, and the gentle clink of crystal against silver. And then, as she moved through the room, she saw him again. He was speaking with Lady Margaret when his gaze lifted and found hers. A slight smile touched his lips, not one of surprise but of recognition, as if he had expected her to come. Lady Margaret, ever perceptive, followed his gaze and turned to Eleanor with a knowing smile. "Ah, Mrs. Langford, I don't believe you've been properly introduced to Mr. Nathaniel Harcourt," she said, gesturing between them. "A dear friend of my husband's, newly returned to London after several years abroad." Nathaniel Harcourt. The name settled in Eleanor's mind, fitting into place like the final piece of a puzzle she had not realized she was assembling. "It is a pleasure," he said, his voice smooth and measured. Eleanor inclined her head. "Likewise, Mr. Harcourt." He studied her with the same quiet curiosity she had noticed before. "I enjoyed your insights at Lady Margaret's salon last week. You have a rare way of seeing the world." Eleanor lifted a brow. "And how do you see the world, Mr. Harcourt?" A slow smile. "With interest. With the understanding that people are often far more complex than they appear." She held his gaze for a beat longer than was necessary. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something stir, not longing, not regret, but intrigue. The evening unfolded with ease, and though she spoke with many, her conversations with Nathaniel felt different. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the quiet enjoyment of exchanging thoughts with someone who truly listened. By the time the night ended, Eleanor found herself lingering at the threshold of the Hollingsworth estate, the crisp night air brushing against her skin. Nathaniel stood a few steps away, speaking with another guest, but before she could step into her waiting carriage, he turned. "I hope this will not be the last time we speak, Mrs. Langford." Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of something unknown. "Neither do I, Mr. Harcourt." And with that, she stepped into the carriage, her heart steady, her mind alight with quiet possibility. Not of love as she had once imagined it, but of something new, something waiting to unfold. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar energy, as though something unseen had shifted in Eleanor's world. She did not dwell on it, nor did she allow herself to assign meaning to what was. At its core, a simple introduction. And yet she could not deny that Nathaniel Harcourt lingered in her thoughts, not as an obsession, not as an aching absence, but as a curiosity. She found herself wondering about him in quiet moments, her mind tracing the lines of his conversation, the way he had listened with patience rather than urgency. He had not pushed, nor had he sought to charm her in the manner of men accustomed to pursuing admiration. Instead, he had merely been present, engaged, interested in the words she spoke, rather than the effect they might have. It was refreshing. Eleanor returned to her routines, but they no longer felt as rigid as they once had. She read in the afternoons, taking her books to the garden where the sun warmed her skin. She moved through the city with renewed attentiveness, finding beauty in the mundane, a street musician playing a mournful tune, the laughter of children chasing one another through the park, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner. And then, one morning, another invitation arrived. This time, it was not from Lady Margaret, but from Nathaniel Harcourt himself. The letter was brief, written in elegant but unembellished script. "Mrs. Langford, ****, I hope this note does not find you unwelcome. I was recently given a rare volume of poetry I believe you would appreciate. If you would be willing, I would be honored to share it with you over tea at the conservatory at Ashburn House this Thursday. Afternoon. ***. Yours sincerely, Nathaniel Harcourt." Eleanor read it twice, then a third time. It was a simple invitation. There was nothing improper about it. Lady Margaret's gatherings had introduced them, and a shared interest in literature was hardly cause for scandal. And yet she hesitated, not because she feared the invitation itself, but because of what it represented. A choice. To decline would be the safer path. To remain within the boundaries of the life she had built. To avoid any possibility of disruption. And yet, she had spent so many years choosing safety. Perhaps it was time to choose something else. On Thursday afternoon, Eleanor dressed with care. Not extravagantly, there was no need for that, but with a quiet elegance that pleased her. A soft grey gown, simple pearl earrings, a touch of lavender water at her wrists. When she arrived at Ashburn House, she was led through the grand hallways to the conservatory, where sunlight streamed through glass panels, illuminating an array of ferns and flowering vines. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of citrus from the small lemon trees placed in decorative pots. Nathaniel stood near a low table set for tea, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Mrs. Langford," he greeted with a small smile. "I am grateful you accepted my invitation." She inclined her head, stepping forward with measured grace. "Your note intrigued me. I must admit, I am curious about this rare volume you mentioned." His smile deepened, and without another word, he reached for a book resting beside the tea service. The binding was old but well preserved. the gold lettering on the spine slightly faded with time. It is a collection of sonnets from an obscure poet whose work never gained wide recognition, but whose words possess a quiet brilliance. He opened the book to a marked page, then extended it toward her. I thought of you when I read this one. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking the book. Her eyes traced the delicate script, the rhythm of the verse, the aching beauty of words that spoke of time, of fleeting moments, of the choice to either grasp at the past or step forward into the unknown. When she looked up, she found Nathaniel watching her, not with expectation, but with understanding. "You seem to know me rather well, Mr. Harcourt," she said quietly. "I know how it feels to stand at a crossroads," he replied. The words settled between them, neither heavy nor demanding, but simply true. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, carefully, she closed the book and placed it on the table between them. "I think," she said softly, "I would like to know more about this poet." Nathaniel nodded, as if he had already known her answer. And so they began. The afternoon unfolded with a kind of ease Eleanor had not known in years. There was no pretense, no guarded conversation laced with unspoken expectations. With Nathaniel, words came naturally, flowing like the sunlight through the conservatory's glass ceiling. They spoke of poetry and the way. Certain verses lingered in the mind, long after they had been read. They spoke of travels his years abroad, her longing to see more of the world beyond the familiar streets of London. They spoke of change, of the way life shifted in small, imperceptible ways until one day, a person found themselves standing at the edge of something new. Eleanor had never spoken so freely outside the pages of her own journal. "You are not what I expected, Mrs. Langford," Nathaniel said at one point, his voice thoughtful rather than teasing. She lifted a brow. "And what, exactly, did you expect?" He considered her for a moment before answering. "Someone content with the life they have." A quiet laugh escaped her lips, not bitter but wry. "Contentment is a peculiar thing, Mr. Harcourt. It is often mistaken for resignation." His gaze did not waver. "And have you resigned yourself then?" She should have brushed off the question, should have redirected the conversation to something safer. But the weight of it hung between them, waiting for an answer. "I don't know," she admitted at last. "Perhaps I did once. Perhaps I still do, in some ways. But lately, I find myself questioning what I once accepted without thought." Nathaniel nodded as though he understood completely. "That is a beginning, at least." A beginning. The word settled in her chest, unfamiliar yet not unwelcome. As the afternoon waned and she prepared to take her leave, Eleanor felt a quiet reluctance, though she did not allow it to show. Nathaniel walked her to the waiting carriage, the golden light of the late afternoon casting long shadows along the cobblestone path. Before she stepped inside, she turned to him, searching for something she could not quite name. "Thank you for today," she said simply. He inclined his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Langford." She hesitated, then allowed herself a small indulgence. "Eleanor," she said softly. "You may call me Eleanor." Something flickered in his expression, not triumph, not expectation, but something warmer, something like quiet recognition. "Then I must insist you call me Nathaniel," he replied. A delicate shift, subtle yet significant. Eleanor stepped into the carriage, feeling the moment settle around her like the first note of a song yet to be played. As the wheels turned and the city passed beyond the window, she did not think of Henry. She did not think of Charles. She thought only of the way the light had caught Nathaniel's eyes when he spoke of beginnings, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to wonder what might come next. The days that followed were filled with quiet contemplation. Eleanor did not seek out Nathaniel, nor did she expect to hear from him so soon. And yet, his presence lingered in her thoughts, not as an intrusive distraction, but as a gentle curiosity, like a melody she could not quite forget. She went about her days as she always had. Breakfast in the sunlit morning room, afternoon walks through the park, evenings spent in her library, where the world inside her books felt more vivid than the one beyond her door. And yet, something had changed. The solitude that once felt like comfort now felt like something else, something thinner, less substantial. A week passed before she saw Nathaniel again. It was at a charity gathering hosted by Lady Dunmore, an event Eleanor had attended out of habit rather than interest. The evening was, as she expected, polite conversation, carefully chosen words, laughter that never quite reached the eyes. And then, across the room, she saw him. Nathaniel stood near the fireplace, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman. He was composed, effortlessly at ease. Yet when his gaze lifted and met hers, there was the faintest flicker of something else, acknowledgement, perhaps even amusement, as though he, too, had not expected their paths to cross so soon. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment before turning back to her conversation. It was a small act of restraint, but she felt the weight of it nonetheless. And yet, as the evening wore on, their paths continued to align. A glance across the room, a brief exchange of pleasantries, a fleeting moment when their hands brushed as he passed her a glass of wine, the touch lingering just long enough to be noticed. Finally, when the crowd had thinned and the evening had taken on the quiet hum of its final hours, Nathaniel found her standing alone near the terrace doors. "Twice in a week, Eleanor," he mused, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "People will begin to talk." She turned to him, lifting a brow. "And what, precisely, would they say?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "That a woman of intellect and grace has found someone who truly listens." A quiet shiver ran down her spine, not from the words alone, but from the way he said them, as though he were merely stating a fact. She exhaled slowly, considering her response. "Then let them talk," she murmured at last. A flicker of something passed through his expression: approval, perhaps even admiration. He did not press further, did not demand more than she was willing to give. Instead, he merely extended his arm. "Walk with me." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow, and together they stepped out onto the terrace, into the cool night air, into a conversation yet to be written. The terrace was quiet, save for the distant murmur of the city beyond the gardens. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and the glow of lanterns cast soft pools of golden light along the stone pathway. Eleanor walked beside Nathaniel in measured silence, the warmth of his presence a subtle contrast to the cool night air. She had not intended to linger, had not intended to indulge in anything beyond the polite boundaries expected of a woman in her position. And yet, there was something disarming about Nathaniel, not in the way of reckless charm or bold declarations, but in the way he simply was: present, steady, As they reached the edge of the terrace, Eleanor turned her gaze toward the darkened gardens. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "Miss what?" "The life you had before you returned to London. The places you've seen. The freedom of it all." Nathaniel exhaled, his gaze thoughtful. "Yes and no." She glanced at him, waiting. "I miss the novelty of unfamiliar places. The way the world feels wider when one is constantly moving. That there is something to be said for returning, for rediscovering what was once familiar and seeing it with new eyes." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about leaving, Eleanor?" She hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because admitting it aloud felt like stepping too close to the edge of something unknown. "Yes," she said finally. "I think about it often." Nathaniel nodded, as though he had already known. "And yet you stay." She let out a quiet, wry laugh. "And yet I stay." There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. "Not all cages have locks," he murmured. The words settled between them, and Eleanor felt them more deeply than she cared to admit. For so long, she had believed that leaving was an impossibility, that the weight of expectation, of duty, of the choices she had already made, bound her to the life she lived. But standing here, beside Nathaniel, she felt something stir a realization, perhaps, or merely the quiet suggestion of another path. "You think too highly of me, Nathaniel," she said softly. "I am not a woman of great courage." He studied her for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps not yet." A small shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the quiet certainty in his voice. A breeze rustled the leaves, and Eleanor turned her gaze back to the lantern-lit garden. She should return inside, should step back before she wandered too far. But when Nathaniel extended his hand, palm open, waiting, she hesitated only a moment before placing hers within it. It was not an act of defiance. It was not a promise. It was simply a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The warmth of Nathaniel's hand against hers was unexpected, not for its physicality, but for the quiet reassurance it offered. He did not hold her tightly, did not press his fingers against her own in a way that demanded anything more than she was willing to give. He simply held her hand, as though acknowledging the weight of the moment without speaking it aloud. Eleanor let out a slow breath, her gaze shifting back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. "We should return before anyone notices." Nathaniel did not immediately let go. "And if they do?" She turned to him, arching a brow. "Then they will talk." His lips quirked into the barest hint of a smile. "Ah, let them talk. Wasn't that what you said earlier?" Eleanor exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head as she gently withdrew her hand. "There is a difference between speaking boldly and acting recklessly." "Is there?" She met his gaze, searching for the tease in his words, but there was none. Only quiet curiosity, as though he were asking a question she was not yet ready to answer. Instead, she offered him a small, knowing smile. "Yes, Mr. Harcourt." "There is." Nathaniel inclined his head in a gesture of concession, but something in his expression told her the conversation was not yet over. They returned inside, slipping back into the swirl of polite conversation and laughter. But Eleanor was keenly aware of Nathaniel's presence across the room. She could feel the weight of his gaze. Not possessive, not demanding, simply there. A quiet reminder of the moment they had just shared. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir within her that was not resignation, not duty but possibility. In the days that followed, She found herself thinking of him more than she intended. She told herself it was simply the novelty of it all, the unexpectedness of meeting someone who listened, not as a means to an end, not out of obligation, but simply because he wished to understand her. And yet, it was more than that. It was the way he had spoken to her. Not as a wife, not as a widow, not as a woman to be pitied or admired, but simply as Eleanor. She had spent so long existing within the carefully drawn lines of her life that she had forgotten what it felt like to step beyond them. And Nathaniel Harcourt was a man who did not simply exist within the lines. He questioned why they were drawn in the first place. A week later, another note arrived. Eleanor, ****, there is an exhibition at the gallery this Saturday, landscapes from artists who see the world in a way most do not. I believe you would appreciate it. If you are willing, I would be honored to accompany you. Yours, Nathaniel. Eleanor traced her fingers over the ink, feeling the weight of the invitation. It was not improper. Not entirely widows had more freedom than married women, after all. And yet, accepting it felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. A year ago, she would not have hesitated to decline. But now, she found herself reaching for a pen. Nathaniel, I believe I would enjoy that very much. Eleanor. And just like that, the lines she had once so carefully obeyed blurred a little more. The morning of the exhibition arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. Eleanor had dressed with care, though she told herself it was simply out of respect for the occasion. A deep blue gown, understated yet elegant. A silver pendant resting at her collarbone. Nothing ostentatious. Nothing that would draw undue attention, just enough to feel like herself. When the carriage arrived at the gallery, Nathaniel was already waiting. He stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze warm as he took her in. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, offering his arm. She hesitated for only a breath before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. "Good morning, Nathaniel." It was strange, how natural it felt to say his name. How easily she had let go of the formality that once seemed necessary. They stepped inside, greeted by the quiet hum of conversation and the faint scent of oil paint lingering in the air. The gallery was spacious, sunlight filtering through tall windows to illuminate the canvases lining the walls. Eleanor moved through the exhibition with slow, measured steps, taking in each piece with careful attention. Some paintings were bold and untamed, wild brushstrokes capturing the raw beauty of distant landscapes. Others were softer, more deliberate scenes of quiet lakes, of golden fields bathed in the last light of day. "You seem drawn to this one," Nathaniel observed as she lingered before a particular piece. It was a painting of a single tree standing atop a windswept hill, its branches reaching toward an endless sky. The colors were rich yet melancholic, as though caught between the final breath of autumn and the first whisper of winter. Eleanor nodded. "There is something unfinished about it," she murmured, "as if it exists between one moment and the next, not quite belonging to either." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Much like people, then?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You think people are unfinished?" "I think we are always changing," he said simply. "Always caught between who we were and who we might become." The words settled over her, quiet yet profound. For so long, she had believed that her path had already been written. that the choices of her past had carved out the road before her, leaving little room for anything new. But standing here, beside Nathaniel, she felt the stirrings of something different. Not recklessness, not impulsivity, but possibility. They wandered the gallery for another hour, speaking in quiet tones, their conversation shifting between art and literature, between the past and the uncertain future. And when they stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, Eleanor realized that she did not wish for the day to end just yet. Nathaniel seemed to sense it, for he hesitated only briefly before asking, "Would you care for a walk?" Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not think of obligation. She did not think of what was expected of her. She thought only of what she wanted, and so she smiled. "I would like that very much." The evening air carried the soft hum of the city, the distant clip of horse hooves against cobblestone, the low murmur of voices passing along the edges of the park. But here, within the quiet stretch of their walk, there was a strange kind of intimacy, not in touch, not in words, but in the simple act of being. Eleanor had not expected this, had not expected the ease with which she could exist beside Nathaniel, without pretense, without the weight of expectation pressing down upon her shoulders. And yet, as they slowed their steps near the edge of the park, a quiet reluctance settled over her. The carriage awaited, its dark silhouette blending into the dim glow of gaslit streets. Their time together was ending, and for the first time in far too long, Eleanor found herself wishing for more. Nathaniel must have sensed it, for he turned to her, studying her with that quiet intensity she was coming to recognize. "I enjoyed today," he said simply. Eleanor hesitated, then allowed herself the truth. "So did I." A small silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the moment before a decision is made, before a path is chosen. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, his voice thoughtful when he spoke again. "Would you allow me to call on you sometime, Eleanor?" She should have hesitated, should have considered the implications, the whispers that might follow. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. She met his gaze, steady and unguarded. "Yes," she murmured. "I would like that." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips, not triumph, not expectation, but something quieter. "Then I shall look forward to it." With a small inclination of his head, he stepped back, allowing her to turn toward the waiting carriage. But just as she placed her hand on the door, she paused, glancing back at him, standing beneath the soft glow of a street lamp. She found herself caught in something unspoken and understanding, a possibility, a moment suspended between past and future. And then, without another word, she stepped inside. The carriage doors closed, the wheels turned, and as the city passed beyond the window, Eleanor pressed her fingertips lightly against her palm, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of something fleeting. She had not expected this, but for the first time in years, she did not shy away from the unknown. She welcomed it. The days that followed carried a quiet shift, subtle yet undeniable. Eleanor found herself moving through her routine with a new awareness, as though the world had taken on a sharper clarity. The books she read felt richer, the morning light through her windows warmer, the passing hours less like something to be endured and more like something to be noticed. And beneath it all, there was the anticipation of Nathaniel's visit. She told herself it was a small thing, an afternoon call, no different from the countless polite visits she had received over the years. But she knew that was a lie. This was different, because for the first time in years, she was waiting for someone. When the day finally arrived, Eleanor dressed with careful thought, though she told herself it was only courtesy. A soft ivory gown, unadorned but elegant, the delicate silver chain at her throat catching the light as she moved. She did not fuss with her hair, did not linger before the mirror any longer than necessary. And yet, as the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, she felt something stir low in her chest, something that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with expectation. Nathaniel was shown into the drawing room, where a fire burned low in the hearth, casting warm light across the space. He stood as she entered, offering a polite bow, but there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch a quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken awareness that this was not merely a social visit. "Eleanor," he greeted, his voice steady. "Nathaniel," she returned, allowing herself the smallest smile. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with the soft clink of tea being poured, the occasional crackle of the fire. Conversation came easily, as it had before. They spoke of books, of music, of small, inconsequential things that somehow did not feel inconsequential at all. That beneath it, there was something else, a quiet thread of something unspoken, something lingering in the pauses between words, in the way his gaze held hers just a moment longer than necessary. And Eleanor felt it, the shift, the possibility, the slow unraveling of something she could not yet name. As the hour stretched on, Nathaniel set his cup aside, studying her with a contemplative expression. "May I ask you something?" She tilted her head slightly. "You may ask, but I make no promises to answer." His lips quirked at that, but his voice remained thoughtful. "If you could go anywhere without obligation, without expectation, where would you go?" Eleanor blinked, startled by the question, not because it was improper, but because she could not remember the last time someone had asked what she wanted. She exhaled slowly, considering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have never allowed myself to think of such things." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, then said, almost too softly, "Perhaps it is time you did." The words settled between them, and Eleanor felt their weight more than she cared to admit, because for the first time, she wondered if she truly could choose, if she truly could step beyond the life she had always known. Where would she go? And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine an answer. The days passed in quiet progression, each one marked by something small but significant, a note left at her door, a shared glance across a crowded room, a conversation that lingered in her thoughts long after it had ended. Eleanor had not realized how much of herself she had buried beneath duty and expectation until Nathaniel had asked her that simple question. Where would you go? It had unsettled her at first, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had never allowed herself the luxury of thinking about it. But now, she did. She thought of the quiet countryside, of the sea at dawn, of distant cities where no one knew her name. She thought of freedom, not the reckless kind, not the escape of a desperate woman, but the kind that came from choosing one's own path. She thought of possibility, and more than anything, she thought of him. Nathaniel had become a quiet presence in her life, not pushing, not demanding, only there, offering her something she had not realized she was missing. Not passion, not promises, but something deeper. Understanding. One evening, as autumn edged toward winter, She found herself standing at the window of her drawing room, watching as the city lights flickered against the falling dusk. A gentle knock sounded at the door, and when she turned, he was there. She had not expected him, but she was not surprised. He stepped forward, his expression thoughtful, searching. "You've been thinking," he observed. Eleanor let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I have." He hesitated, then asked, "Have you found an answer?" She turned back to the window, her gaze distant, but her heart steady. "I used to believe my life was already written," she murmured, "that the choices I made in the past bound me to a path I could not change." She exhaled slowly, as if shedding the weight of those years. "But I see now that was never true." Nathaniel remained silent, waiting. She turned to face him fully, her eyes clear, her voice unwavering. "I don't know where I will go, but I do know that, for the first time, I am choosing for myself." A slow, knowing smile touched his lips, not triumph, not expectation, but something quieter. "Eleanor," he said gently, "that is the only choice that has ever mattered." The room was quiet, the fire casting flickering light against the walls. And as Eleanor looked at him, this man who had asked nothing of her but had given her the space to be, she realized the truth of it. Life was not a path set in stone. It was not something to be endured, nor was it something to be dictated by the past. It was a story to be written, moment by moment, choice by choice. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor was ready to write her own. She smiled not for him, not for society, but for herself. And as she stepped forward, embracing the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she knew this. The greatest freedom is not in running from the past, nor in chasing the future. It is in the courage to stand in the present and say, "Asterisk, this is who I am. And this is where I begin. Asterisk,